Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Alhamdulillah thumma alhamdulillah wa ma taufiqi wa i'tisami illa billah. Alaika tawakkaltu wa ilaika unib. Alhamdulillahil khail wallazina jahadu fina lanahdiyannahum subulana wa innallaha lama'al muhsinin. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Sudah Tan Khalid, Menteri Besar dan ahli Majlis Mesyuarat Kerajaan Negeri yang hadir dari Selangor dan Kelantan, sudah Amidi dan pimpinan ABIM, Wadah PKPIM, tetamu kehormat, tetamu dari luar, saudara-saudara yang dimuliakan. Kita membicarakan soal nahdah atau resurgence. Yang tentunya saya tidak wajah menggantikan tempat Rasyid Ghanusi, tapi kebetulan 2 minggu yang lalu di Istanbul saya sempat bincang panjang dengan beliau perkembangan mutakhir di rantau dan dunia Arab dan juga di Tunisia. Ini menyebabkan beliau tidak dapat memenuhi hajat rakan-rakan. Beliau menamakan parti yang diasaskan di Tunisia sebagai Nahdah. Tapi dalam konteks ini saya rasa tepat bahawa Nahdah itu istilah yang lebih tepat untuk membayangkan resurgence kerana asasnya itu asas etika Islam dan konteks perbicaraan itu lebih luas. As for the general discourse, at one end of the spectrum, Islamic resurgence may be seen as being synonymous with the rise of political Islam, Islamic radicalism, or militancy. The other interpretation which we generally share is, of course, the Islamic Renaissance or Nahdah Islamiyah. When I wrote the Asian Renaissance some 15-20 years back, many of my friends alerted me that the term Renaissance applies essentially to the Florentine Italian experience, which actually meant the secularization or abandonment of moral values. That is why I did qualify in that our Renaissance means change, reassertion of faith, ethical principles, and moral values. That is very much an integral part of our da'wah. قال الله تعالى ومن أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا وقال إنني من المسلمين. I think that's the essence of what resurgence is all about, which can be encapsulated from the ayah that I read. Now the view implies therefore the need for tajdeed and islah. That is why before you talk about change, this is, I think, the essence and the thesis that we would like to share this morning, shared by most scholars, is the awareness, is the effort to promote understanding. You can't speak of change or reform, or even change dictators, if we do not have the essence of what it entails. That means enjoin men and women to do good and forbid fasad and evil. So the foundation lies in the Quran and the Sunnah. And of course we have to remain steadfast in Arkan al-Islam and Arkan al-Iman. Because the leap forward can only be attained through this intellectual tradition. I remember the scholarly dissertation by even our colleague Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman talking about Salahuddin which is of course a spectacular, phenomenal example of statesman able to unite the entire ummah at the time when Europe was under Richard the Lionhearted. The focus is, of course, Salahuddin's statecraft and strategy. But Abdul Hamid, interestingly enough, stated and asserted that that change will not take place hadn't it been the preparatory work through mass education, public awareness, the discipline that was required to embark this change. Unlike the strength and historical personalities from Genghis Khan to Richard the Lionhearted and others, but I think the experience of Salahuddin in the historical antecedents of the education, public awareness, and the propensity to change through Islah and Tajdeed is a prerequisite before you talk about total reform. And this is, of course, a challenge when I talk about reformasi in the Malaysian context. The reformasi will not be meaningful or effective without a general understanding of public awareness, an effective da'wah program to instill faith, ethical values, moral principles and precepts that would motivate the public in calling for meaningful change. Now, in contemporary light, of course, we are familiar, not only in the Middle East, but also in this region. Intellectual forebears who are household names: Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abduh, Rashid Reza, and of course, some lesser known personalities which we are trying to also promote. Abdul Rahman al-Kawakibi. I remember in the last meeting of the Ma'had al-Fikr, International Institute of Islamic Thought, I've been pushing very hard that the works of Abdul Rahman al-Kawakibi in Arabic, the great Syrian thinker and reformer, be promoted as well, because other than the basis and understanding of Islamic da'wah and knowledge in changing the character, the shakhsiyah of the Muslim personality, Abdul Rahman al-Kawakibi stresses on the importance of governance, reading societies from despotism. This he wrote, I think, in the 1890s, although at that time the despotism was mainly from the Ottoman Turks. But the message is universal, that you cannot effect change if you talk only of removing dictators, of removing a prime minister, or removing a president. You effect change by total reform of ensuring there's justice and order in the Maqasid Sharia, and also what Tansi Khalid alluded to, the fiqh awlawiyat, in terms of our priorities that we need to establish. But other than al-Kawakibi, in this region, we are fortunate that we can share the experience of our Indonesian friends. Indonesia is quite unique and spectacular in that experience, because the entire work of Islamization, if you read T.W. Arnold, The Preaching of Islam, the Islamization in this Malay archipelago has been relatively peaceful through the works of not only traders, but Sufi leaders, including what is known as the 9 saints of Jawa, able to Islamize peacefully and through even series of negotiations with some of the Hindu and the Buddhist clerics. And of course, we are reminded of the great role of Al-Marhum Muhammad Nasser, who once led Mashumi and became Prime Minister before he was jailed, imprisoned by Sukarno. We have all this great tradition of being imprisoned. Now, Islamic Renaissance therefore signifies a period or revival or resurgence of intense and vigorous intellectual activity in the Muslim Ummah. Sustained, of course, by a deep-seated and passionate commitment to return to the foundational principles of the Quran and the Sunnah. And I think from my limited experience in the ABIM tradition, when we refer to the Usra and the various tamreen or training programs, I think that is in essence. You cannot affect change. You take a very dogmatic, closed, as they refer to, the Taliban-like understanding. The Taliban experience in Afghanistan, because it's interesting, because it started from the madrasa and promote that. But because the interpretation is so rigid and limited, the moment they take over governance, what they preach and what they implement, therefore policies, they become too exclusive. They only view and look at enemies, not issue of governance, not issue of justice for all. That is why I think I need to reiterate the point that the relevance of the intellectual tradition of what we popularize in the Malay terms, tradisi aqliyah, helped popularized also by Naqib Al-Atas, is, I think, is essential. Because without that, we will not have the discernible element in the Renaissance thrust. Of course, we will continue to have within the Ummah, you can sense even priorities here in Malaysia, whether places of worship or the issue of the dog continues to be debated, which is unique. We can hardly find this discourse any part of the Muslim world. And that reflects either our inability to enhance our profile in intellectual discourse, or the intention to bring Muslims, to confine them to issues that is not quite relevant. I remember in my Twitter and Facebook account promoting that famous photograph of the Sultan of Kelantan and the Mufti of Kelantan in 1936. There was a major conference on Muslims and dogs in the year 1936, attended by about 2,000 participants. You see how important it was for Muslims to discuss dogs. Now, they should have at least 5,000 people to discuss morality and corruption and poor education. But they'd probably be able to get 50 people to discuss education. But notwithstanding, what was relevant in this discourse was a photograph of the Sultan of Kelantan with the Mufti of Kelantan, and seated in between them was a dog. Photographed and popularized. And I think I could give credit to the Mufti and the Sultan of Kelantan to portray that it's not a problem. You can continue the discourse. There's a clear procedure and what needs to be done, what is najis, how to deal with it. But it should not be a complex, controversial issue like what is being promoted now in TV3 for a whole week about the dog and the Muslim world. 100,000 people killed in Syria, not reported, But problem of a dog is reported as main news for 7 days and 7 nights. It should reflect the need for intellectual discourse and change, that we are now struggling not only against any form of authoritarian rule, but an attempt to belittle the capability of Muslims to engage in a vibrant, vigorous intellectual discourse. Now, the demands of Islah would also warrant that interpretation of Islamic law be re-examined. That's why I think in the International Institute of Islamic Thought, in the last few years, I think from 1990, the first discourse I remember in Pulau Tioman, where Sheikh Taha Jabir Al-Alwani decided to write to Sheikh Muhammad Al-Ghazali, asking for his views on the need to popularize or get the modern contemporary generation to understand the Turath, the legacy. We talk about Islam, but we hardly have a clear understanding of our Turath, our legacy. Our legacy are fiqh books, or spiritual Sufi texts, are also texts on governance and texts on reinterpretation of Islamic law. So this was responded to by Sheikh Muhammad Al-Ghazali, and then the IIIT decided to then popularize, at least in the English language, the old classics of Muwafaqat of Imam Shatibi, translating the works of Ibn Ashur, and of course the interpretation or the writings of Raisuni, which becomes a standard text of Sidi Fadil, and Jasir Auda, which I prefer to use because at least it marks my difference with Sidi Fadil. But what is important to my mind is the attempt to cultivate that awareness. Nah, yang saya rumuskan tentang hal ini ialah kebangkitan Islam itu tidak akan berlaku tanpa asas pendidikan yang kukuh. Saya bicarakan Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi. Kita bicara Salahuddin kerana kekuatannya, ketokohannya, kehebatannya dapat menggembeling seluruh tenaga umat berhadapan dengan kekuatan Eropah di bawah Maharaja Richard the Lion-Hearted, berhati singa dari Inggris. Tetapi yang ditekankan oleh pemikir ialah bahawa tidak akan muncul Salahuddin itu sekonyong-konyong begitu tanpa asas dan kekuasaan dan tradisi ilmiah dan kesedaran meluas melalui kegiatan dakwah dan tarbiyah di seluruh Iraq. Ini yang menyebabkan bila ada pimpinan begitu, dukungannya mudah. Tak payah berkempen bermalam-malam, kesedarannya begitu mudah. Ya, kerana asas pendidikan itu kukuh. Ini isu. Maka sebab itu saya rojok kepada usaha yang dilakukan oleh Institut Pemikiran Islam dan bagaimana Syekh Taha menulis kepada Syekh Muhammad Al-Ghazali almarhum apa yang harus kita bicarakan. Bagaimana kita bicarakan soal Islam kalau kita tidak kaitkan turaf, khazanah yang lama. Dalam tradisi barat sendiri pun, ya, kalau sudah lihat, dia ada great books. Sudah baca umpamanya Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom di antara pemikir ulum di Amerika. Ya. Dia bicara soal buku-buku asas yang semua sarjana harus baca. Ada great books dan centernya itu Shakespeare. Di kalangan Islam tidak ada. Dia akhirnya ikut itijahat, ikut tren masing-masing. Ada yang kepakarannya sufi saja, ada kepakarannya harakah saja, ada yang kepakarannya fiqh saja. Jadi akhirnya soal anjing dibahaskan siang malam oleh TV3 selama 7 hari. Ya. Tapi soal rasuah tidak. Ini yang menyebabkan mengapa kitab-kitab lama harus digali semula dan dipopularkan. Ia tidak harus menjadi pandangan yang tetap yang tidak boleh dirubah. Tidak boleh dirubah itu hanya Quran. Ya. Tetapi kupasan itu akan membantu kita memberikan kefahaman tentang keperluan semasa. Maka itulah Seri Makasih Syariah yang dikupas, karya Rasuni yang banyak dikupas oleh Siddiq Fadil. Saya memilih yang Jasir Audah rumusannya, dan juga Ibn Ashur tentang Makasih Syariah yang harus dikupas. Ya. But this is I need to emphasize because the nature of politicization of our anger, and it's true. How do you keep quiet when 100,000 Muslims are being killed in Syria? How do you expect us to remain unaffected when women and children are beaten to death or slaughtered in mosques? I asked this question to Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan in my meeting last fortnight, saying that, you sounded very strong. You call these Egyptian leaders like Pharaoh for tolerating this. And you call Bashar Assad the damned dictator. It's too strong. He said to me, very simple, he said, Anwar, I've been Prime Minister for 10 years. I'm leading a great country, impressive economic growth. But I also see mothers and my daughters being killed, and my children being slaughtered. You mean I must keep my job and remain silent, that like many presidents and prime ministers and kings in the world? Or let me perform my task with some manner of integrity and dictate of conscience? Yeah. Fair. Yeah. I appreciate that. But what the point I want to drive home is what is relatively unknown. That the priority in Turkey now, number one, if you ask him, I asked him or his finance minister, what is your number one priority? Education. What is your number one priority is education and da'wah. So we, whilst having the rally like last night, should not be distracted from the main thrust of programs to be conducted by PKPIM, ABIM, etc. That is to cultivate this awareness, to ensure that the level of understanding and capacity to articulate issues is better and more profound. In our strength, in our tradition, as I said, what we share from our Indonesian brothers, in particular, the experience of Muhammad Nasser and the Mashumi, is that it's always been inclusive. They've always been prepared to engage with the Christians and the Hindus and the Buddhists in Indonesia. They have been always ready to engage even with the liberals and the secularists and etc. And we must continue that tradition. And during the launch of Douglas Thompson's book on Muslim Brotherhood and Yusuf Nada, I recounted the experience even in Egypt during the days of the turmoil in the Brotherhood. You can't blame the anger and the frustration. I'm writing about this. When this is the period of calamity for the Muslim world. This is the period of catastrophe for the Muslim world. From the Second World War until now, no country have endured the difficulty and hardship as much as Afghanistan. Virtually destroyed. Partly by the Russian communists, partly by the Americans, and partly by the Muslims themselves. Then Iraq. Partly Lebanon, partly Libya, and now Syria, and now again Egypt. My discussions with Rasha Ghanouchi, will Tunisia be next? After Tunisia, will Turkey be the target? Because Tayyip Erdogan now surfaces and emerges as the most articulate, outspoken, and courageous leader of the Muslim world. I acknowledge that. But still, I would like to emphasize, particularly in the role of those in the movement, in Islamic parties, and movements like ABIM, or Islamic parties including PAS, in some manner even Keadilan, and our brothers and sisters, that the focus will have to be creating this understanding and public awareness through education, and what was alluded to again by Tansi Khalid, economic empowerment through a program of justice. We here, for example, you can see the discourse and exchanges. We're still very confused between the Malay agenda and the Muslim agenda, between the Malay racist program and the Muslim just program. And mind you, this is not something new. I remember since the 70s, when PKPIM and ABIM became the target and attacked by Biro Tata Negara, in the late 70s, man, it's not something new, that this new Islamic message is universal message, is not a Malay message. Of course, at that time, we still used the argument well articulated by Naqib al-Atas, that the essence of the Malay psyche and character is still Islam. You erase Islam from the Malay character, then it becomes extremely shallow, devoid of language, devoid of culture, of course devoid of faith. But we continue to have this discourse, partly because of our failure to give meaning and depth to the discourse. So that is why I will urge you that in this lahza, take a more tolerant and open view. I would say that I'm very fortunate being exposed to the brothers internationally and locally. Not only people in the movement. I mean, we benefited immensely from the works of Hazal Banna, Mustafa Mashur, of the Ikhwan, of Maududi, Qurshid, of Jamaat, of Muhammad Nasser and Hamka in Indonesia. But also people like Marhum Ismail Farouqi, Fazlur Rahman of Chicago, that gives a broader view. Or even Hussein Nasser, of Washington University, may be attacked as being pro-Shia by mentioning Hussein Nasser. But that shows the inclusiveness and the strength of a movement. And I was sharing with some of the brothers just now, not only that, at that time of taking from Hassan Banna to Hussein Nasser, of course the spectrum is broad enough in their manner of interpretation and articulating Islam. Then you have Toshihiko Ijutsu, God and Man and the Quran, the great prominent Muslim scholar of Japan, at a time when we only know Honda and Isuzu and Suzuki, or whatever Japanese products. But then we promoted Muslim scholarship from Japan. But then we extend beyond that. I think for a Muslim intellectual, we have to read Paul Baran, because you can understand the rejection of an extreme capitalist framework, although from a very leftist or socialist understanding. He didn't share with me on this. But my point is, We cannot curb, because we live in a multiracial, pluralistic world. How do you expect us to engage with the intellectuals in Malaysia or the world if you don't read Frantz Fanon or Herbert Marcuse? These were the intellectuals that influenced vastly the thinking of that generation. And not all their views can be considered all un-Islamic or anti-Islamic. And this is where I think the understanding is important. Many people have accused me, as you know, too liberal or too plural. But the essence, finally, the essence is the Quran and the Sunnah. If there is a clear view that transgress, I reject. But otherwise, we need to learn. And I think credit goes to that generation of ABIM leaders, because that allowed us to have the understanding. Take Edward Said. We are talking about Islamophobia now. It's another issue that we have to deal with. A strong, not only Orientalism. Orientalism, as you know, this is great magnum opus Orientalism by Edward Said, hailed as tour de force in post-colonial studies. But he probably it was the first, Edward Said, a Palestinian Christian, probably was the first in modern times to make reference to Islamophobia. He wrote in 1985 the connection between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and criticized writers who do not recognize that hostility to Islam in the modern Christian West has historically gone hand in hand with anti-Semitism and has stemmed from the same source and nourished at the same stream. And based on that view in 1985, 7 years later, he wrote Orientalism, which was also the standard text of ABIM leaders in the late 1970s to early 80s. But Islamophobia now is more insidious because it can be likened to racism in the most virulent kind. It's like racism on steroids. Now, the cancerous nature of this fear lies in it being translated into the practice of discriminating against Muslims by excluding them from the economic, social, and public life of the nation. So you find the remnants in the Syrian episode, now very clearly in the Egyptian experience. Anything related to Islam or Islamic parties or Islamic movement or Islamic worldview or Islamic personality is rejected outright. Now, I don't want to necessarily bore you with the view that Islam is always under siege. I mean, this is not something new due to prejudice or misunderstanding, but my take in this address is essentially to remind you and encourage you to get back to the basics, to the foundational basis of our struggle through massive, effective exposure and training, and giving this opportunity to our young brothers and sisters, the opportunity to learn and debate from the very simplest beginning. But it has got to be through a very, very vigorous intellectual tradition. Saya membicarakan hal-hal yang lebih contemporary, sudah dengar pandangan saya tentang Suria dan Mesir dan Rohingya dan Bangladesh dan Gaza, Palestin. Tetapi pada sesi ini saya ingin menumpukan tentang keperluan tradisi ilmu dan pengajian. Ya. Dan sebab itu bila ditanya, saya kata tadi Tayyip Erdogan, walaupun kita kenal dia sebagai pejuang dan pemimpin yang petah dan berani, bertanya aja keutamaan nombor 1 dakwah dan pendidikan. Peruntukan paling besar pendidikan. Usaha paling utama sekolah dan universiti. Dan perkembangan program yang paling banyak di Turki semasa dia 10 tahun jadi Perdana Menteri, pusat penyelidikan, universiti-universiti baru dan sekolah-sekolah yang lebih bermutu. Dan sebab itu di antara perkara yang, walaupun saya ini namanya penasihat ekonomi, tapi nasihat nombor 1 saya kepada Menteri Besar, pendidikan. Tumpuan, walaupun pendidikan dalam konteks Malaysia ini bukan tanggungjawab negeri, ini tanggungjawab persekutuan. Oleh tanggungjawab persekutuan itu diabaikan, bahawa ada pelan-pelan baru, maka saya minta supaya Tan Sri berikan keutamaan, dan dengan kerjasama Exco Halimah pun ada dalam bidang pendidikan, dakwah dan kesedaran yang meluas. Institusi yang di bawah kelolaan Selangor umpamanya, tanpa kecuali harus berikan ruang sebaik mungkin pendidikan bermutu dan peluang pendedahan kepada percambahan maklumat, termasuk maklumat tentang Islam. Kita kena bezakan. There is this enormous source of information. You remember this poem by T.S. Eliot? There's information, but not all information can be considered knowledge. Not all knowledge can be twisted in that category of wisdom. So we have the knowledge we have lost in information, whereas the wisdom we have lost in knowledge. So I think it is very essential that we give that opportunity to our students, the best that they could find. And to me, you talk about Islamic resurgence, it would be meaningless without that essence. I want to emphasize only that point. And I think in my discussion with Ahmad Chitonji, that is also an issue that he would, of course, remind that too many things happening, too many would enrage us. Here in our context, even cheating in the elections is an issue. Massive corruption is an issue. Price hike for petroleum 2 kupang is also an issue. I have now popularized a new song, RM1 2 kupang, badan sakit, ingat utang. But that should not, I remember, should not deflect us from our central focus on da'wah and education. Because we have seen the level of understanding permeating in the region is much less. In our discussion with the leader of Qardawi or Ghanousi recently, of course, you can't deny the awareness, Islamic resurgence is a fact. And for the first time probably in the world, they have to recognize it. Even you choose a democratic process, people will still have an option to support Islamic-based parties or Islamic parties. But having said that, I still need to emphasize, reiterate my earlier point, that public awareness on education, reform in Islamic context is still essential. And to me, resurgence in terms of tajdeed and islah is a requirement, but it must begin with a major effort, popular move by Muslim organizations to promote that understanding on issues of freedom, of justice, including gender equality. That is the essence in the Maqasid Sharia. That's why I believe, other than the general topics, the Maqasid is important because you talk about freedom of conscience, freedom of expression. you talk about justice, which includes economic justice. It's very important. In Islam, in Islamic terminology, justice is paramount. Before even you talk about freedom or democracy, because democracy is only meaningful if you use democracy to promote reform for justice. If you choose democracy to enrich the leaders and their families and setting up new companies through democratic process, legitimacy through elections, but illegitimate in terms of policies. So justice is still the main thrust of opposition. May I express again my profound thanks and gratitude to Amidi and ABIM leadership for giving me this opportunity. And may I be able to edit these texts and probably get you to read them in the next day or two. Thank you. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.